Good morning. We are working on Social Studies Chapter 9. We're almost to the end of our chapter. We will be wrapping up next week, planning on our test being next week, Friday. So just know that we will be having a Social Studies test on Friday. It is art next week, Wednesday. We don't have school on Monday, so we got pushed all the way to Friday with the test. So Tuesday, we will do the last section of our reading, get our comprehension pages. Thursday, we will correct comprehension pages and do a quick review. Test on Friday. Okay, so wrapping it up. Let's look at our terms. Ryan, tell us about the agency.
A U.S. field office. Government field office.
U.S. government field office. Remember, we have the Indian Affairs Office, the Indian Affairs agent. Goldberth was the one that we were reading about. They're the ones that try to keep the relations good between the U.S. government and the American Indians. Didn't do quite such a good job. Traditional Dakota. Well,
The Dakota who did not want to assimilate, who wanted to keep their traditional
Traditional Dakota wanted to keep their traditions. They did not want to assimilate. They wanted to stay how they've always been for the thousands of years. This is who we are. They did not want to assimilate. They resisted that assimilation. So then what is the farm Dakota, Sam?
The Dakota that assimilated in some of the ways to the European settlers.
Yeah, the Dakota that assimilated in certain ways to the European settlers, like farming. So they picked up the farming practices of the settlers. They maybe changed the way they looked, cut their hair, changed their dress. Some of it was because they realized times are different. We can't live like we've lived for thousands of years because now we're on this tiny little reservation. So we can't be how we've always been. Some of it was maybe if we look more like the settlers, they won't be scared of us and they'll leave us alone so we can be ourselves. So there are different reasons why people were choosing to do some assimilation. Remember, we learned yesterday that it did cause conflict between the traditional and the farm Dakota because they both wanted what was best for their people, but they went about it in different ways, and so they were upset about that. The traditional Dakota were the ones that were fighting in the war. The farm Dakota, they were the ones that were trying to help the settlers. They were trying to get them released from being captive. A lot of them had relatives who were settlers. So there was conflict during that war. The farm Dakota were scared that the traditional Dakota would turn on them. They turned on all of the innocent settlers. Are they going to fight against us too? So there was conflict during the war. Internment camp, Amelia.
A place for civilians, prisoners of war, and political prisoners of health.
Yeah, so it's that bigger place. It's not just the tiny little jail cell. It's a bigger place for a lot of people to be sent. It could be civilians, like we talked about in World War II with the Japanese. Could be prisoners of war or political prisoners. We're going to find out today what happened with the internment camps after the war. Exile. Peyton.
When someone is forced to leave their country or homeland.
When someone's forced to leave their country or homeland. And we're again going to find out today who is exiled after the war. So let's look at page 182, the aftermath. We finished with our war yesterday. The Dakota definitely did not win. The southern Minnesota was ravaged. It was destroyed by this war. Farms were burned down. Towns were destroyed. People are homeless. People have been killed. 500 settlers, innocent settlers, had been killed. So 70 soldiers, 75 to 100 Dakota soldiers. But think of all of those innocent settlers that were killed. So we're going to find out. We heard at the very end of yesterday that there were terrible consequences against all Dakota, even the innocent ones. We're going to find out about those consequences. That fall, Colonel Sibley set up a military court to judge the hundreds of Dakota that his men had taken prisoner. He set up his court in the kitchen of one of the Lower Sioux trading houses. The judges were a panel of Army officers who just days before had fought in the Dakota War. So now they're judging against people that they were fighting against. Do you think it's going to be a fair judgment?
No.
Yeah, that right there is kind of telling me they were just fighting against them, fighting for their lives. So they're probably not going to be very unbiased. They rushed through dozens of cases each day. The Dakota defendants often were brought to court chained together in groups. Like some other military trials of the period, they had no lawyers present their case, so they couldn't defend themselves. So here they are being judged by somebody who they were trying to kill just days before. They have no way to defend themselves to say what they were doing, why it was happening. I don't think this is going to end well. The missionary Stephen Riggs, who had worked for years among the Dakota, was troubled by what he considered a rush to judgment. I dislike the way the trials were conducted, he wrote. If the Indians have done wickedness, they should have something like a fair trial, even for our own sake. Think about what we've heard in the Constitution. You have a right to a fair trial. You have a right to defend yourself. They didn't give the Indians, the Dakota, that right. Unlike Riggs, most Minnesotans supported the trials. Why do you think most Minnesotans were supporting the trials?
They were attacked.
Because they were attacked. So they were like, yeah, put them in jail. Get rid of them. They were killing my neighbors. They killed some of my family members. So the Minnesotans are saying, yeah, they're guilty. Without even hearing the case, they had already judged them and decided they were guilty and they needed to be taken care of. Outraged by the war, most settlers wanted to see the Dakota punished. Dakota soldiers had killed hundreds of people. Many survivors had been forced to witness the deaths of their friends and families. Most Minnesotans demanded revenge. Newspapers such as the Faribault Central Republican expressed it this way: extermination. What does extermination mean? Andrea?
Like kill, like when you call an exterminator to get rid of like the rats in your house or whatever.
Yeah, when you call an exterminator for the bugs or the pests at your house, they kill them all. So they're calling for extermination. So they're wanting to kill the Dakota. Swift, sure, and terrible is the only thing that can give the people of Minnesota satisfaction or a sense of security. The military court took 39 days to sentence 303 Dakota men to death. The convicted men were marched to a new military camp near Mankato. Under U.S. law, none of those men could be executed or killed without the approval of President Abraham Lincoln. At the urging of Minnesota missionary Henry Whipple, Lincoln's staff reviewed the cases. The more Lincoln learned, the more troubled he felt. In November, he met with Whipple, who described the terrible conditions on the reservations prior to the war and asked the president to show mercy. So President Lincoln was looking at the different perspectives. He understands that what the Dakota did was awful, but he's also looking at why did they do this? Look at how they were being treated. There's more to it than they just went out and massacred people. So he's wanting to show mercy to them. In the end, Lincoln approved the execution of 39 Dakota who had been convicted of crimes against civilians. They were the ones that were going out and killing the settlers. On the morning of December 26, 1862, in front of a large crowd in Mankato's public square, 38 of the Dakota selected by Lincoln were hanged. One man, Roundwind, or Tatamia, was spared at the last minute. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history, before or since. So this is the largest. Most states don't have capital punishment anymore. I don't know if most, but there's a lot of states that don't have capital punishment. Some states still do.
What are those states?
I don't know off the top of my head which states they are. I do know there are some that do have lethal injection, or they have electrocution, the electric chair. We don't hang people anymore because it takes a long time for somebody to die when they're hanging, and it's not very humane. Back then, they didn't have what we have now. So that's what they did. They either hung people or they shot them. But this is the largest mass execution.
What is capital?
Capital punishment is killing somebody for their crimes.
Oh, okay.
President Lincoln ordered the rest of the convicted men be moved from Mankato to a military prison camp in Iowa called Camp McClellan. While in prison there, more than 120 of the nearly 300 Dakota men died as a result of poor conditions. So think about some of the stuff we talked about with the concentration camps. There were poor conditions at this prison camp. So they got sick, they were too cold, they weren't treated very well, so they still died because of the conditions they were living in. Ran with the sound of a rattle. Ran with the sound of a rattle, or Hadayanka, was the son-in-law of Red Banner, a respected Dakota leader. Sentenced to death, he wrote of his frustration at being wrongly accused. I have not killed, wounded, or injured a white man or any white persons. I have not participated in the plunder of their property. And yet today I am set apart for execution and must die in a few days. My wife and my children are dear to me. Let them not grieve for me. Let them remember that the brave shall be prepared to meet death, and I will do as becomes a Dakota. So a lot of people are against capital punishment for this reason. Sometimes somebody who is innocent is wrongly accused. They're found guilty and they are killed. And then sometimes after the fact, it comes out, oh yeah, they were innocent. Oops. We can't bring them back to life, right? When you're in jail and you're found to be wrongly accused that you are innocent, they can release you and you can still have a life. The trouble with capital punishment is sometimes there's a shadow of a doubt and people don't see that. Sometimes, I mean, we have it on tape. We know exactly what happened. But sometimes, like way back then, they don't have anybody grabbing their phone, taking it out and taking pictures and videos of people doing the crimes. They can't prove that they did it. So he could be lying. He could have maybe committed the crimes and not being honest about it. He could be lying. Or he could have been wrongly accused and people thought that he did the crimes and really he didn't. And now he's being killed for it. Edward?
I know the odds of white man dying being falsely accused.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I know the odds of a white man dying because he's falsely accused.
What is that?
It's 1 in 28, and for a black man, it's 1 in 8.
Wow. So what Edward is saying is the odds of a white man in today's society, right? You're talking about in today's world. Now, I haven't done this research, so this is what Edward has seen, but I can't say that it's for a fact. But he's saying that he's seen that the odds of a white man being falsely accused and being put to death is 1 in 28. The odds of a black man being falsely accused and being put to death is 1 in 8. Why do you think there's that difference?
Racism and like inequality.
Yeah, we're still battling against racism. We know it's present in our society, sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways. It's still something that our society is battling, like we've talked about with the riots. And we were looking at the different perspectives, just like with the war. It's still something that we're fighting against. And that's one of the things that has come out. There's more, there's so many different facets to that we just don't have time to cover it in our class. But I mean, you could have a whole college class just on those statistics and what we could learn from it, why there is what there is, and there's so much tied into it. So we can't get into it all in a 6th grade history class, but there is a lot involved. Colin.
Facets is our vocabulary.
Really? And I just used a vocab word? Oh, I'm feeling smart now. Sweet. All right. So let's see. Oh, that's it for what we're reading. No, we're still reading. Okay, turn the page. Whew. All right, so on page 184, this is handwritten on White House stationery. This 3-page document named the 39 Dakota that President Lincoln approved to be executed. Shown here is the first page. So they wrote out who was sentenced to death. And like the person on the previous page, he didn't think that he deserved to die. He's saying, I'm being falsely accused. We don't know if anybody else on here was. I was just checking because the one person was released at the last minute. But that is not the person that was just talking about. Ran with the sound of a rattle is the one saying he was falsely accused. Roundwind is the one that was released. So we don't know if there's anybody else who was executed who shouldn't have been. There obviously were Dakota that were killing the settlers. 500 settlers had died. Okay, so hopefully they weren't innocent men being put to death. Exile. After the war, the U.S. government believed it was not safe for the Dakota to stay in Minnesota. Although many had fled after the war, nearly 2,000 Dakota men, women, and children were in the custody of Sibley's army. The convicted men went to Mankato to be held until their cases were reviewed. The U.S. government decided to force the rest of the Dakota, including many who did not participate in the acts, to leave their homeland. About 1,700 Dakota women, children, and elders, who obviously were not fighting in this war, they were forced to travel just over 100 miles from the Lower Sioux Agency to an internment camp on the riverbanks below Fort Snelling. The march was hard and dangerous, so they were walking. They had to walk over 100 miles. Kids, elderly people. Okay. Despite being guarded by U.S. soldiers, the Dakota were attacked by settlers as they passed through the town of Henderson. The settlers were so angry. They weren't thinking straight that these are innocent people. These aren't the people that were attacking us. But they saw Dakota and they thought, ooh, horrible people. They were massacring. We're going to attack them now. Not okay. At least one Dakota child was killed on the march, and several were injured. The 4-mile-long group of wagons, animals, and people arrived at Fort Snelling on November 23, 1862. The conditions at Fort Snelling were difficult. The Dakota were encamped on the riverbank surrounded by a wooden wall. They were guarded and fed by U.S. soldiers. At times, they received permission to gather wood and fish outside the camp, but this could be risky. There were many people still angry about the war, and several Dakota were attacked and killed. So while they wanted to have that freedom to be able to go out and fish and get some fresh food, they were scared to go out because even though they were innocent, they were scared they were going to be attacked just because they were Dakota. Measles and other diseases were also spreading that winter. This affected both the Dakota and the many settlers who fled to St. Paul during the war. Overall, between 100 and 200 Dakota died from disease, illness, and attacks during the miserable winter of 1862 to 1863. So think about an internment camp. People are living in close conditions. So they have tents where all their cots are set up in, so they're not separated. Think about with COVID, how we've done a lot of quarantining, separating, 6 feet social distancing to help keep the spread down. They didn't have 6 feet social distancing, and measles spreads really easily and quickly. And measles at this time, they didn't have a vaccine for. We have a vaccine for measles now, so people don't typically die from measles. But back then, they didn't have a vaccine for it. They didn't have the medicine for it. So the measles was spreading, and people were dying easily. By the early 1863, the U.S. government had canceled all treaties they had signed with the Dakota and Minnesota. So these treaties they signed in 1851 and 1858, the U.S. government said, you went to war against us. Done. No more treaties. The reservation and the annuities or gone. You have zero land now. We're not going to help you with any money or food. So you don't have land to live on. You have no way of getting food. You don't have money to trade with the traders. You don't have the land to hunt on. The Dakota would be forced to leave the state. In the spring, those who had survived the winter in the internment camp were exiled. You can no longer be where your people have been for thousands of years. Steamboats, barges, and trains carried more than 1,500 Dakota on rivers and overland to a reservation at Crow Creek in what is now South Dakota. It was a desolate place and food was scarce. So think about Minnesota. We've got forests, we've got lakes. You go into South Dakota and they have the Badlands. The Badlands are flat, hilly, like little hills. It's, if you've ever driven through South Dakota, I mean, it's not as scenic as it is in Minnesota. I love the landscape of Minnesota where you're driving through the woods and you can drive by the lakes and there's so much to be offered. In South Dakota, they don't have that. Very, very different. So the Dakota don't really know how to live there. It's not an easy place to live in. The government sent food, but it was never enough and almost always came late. Hundreds of Dakota died from hunger and disease. The missionary John P. Williamson, who had worked with Dakota in Minnesota, went to visit. He was appalled by the conditions there. He called Crow Creek a desert and a place that was totally unfit for the habitation of any human being. In 1866, the government finally let the exiled Dakota move to a new reservation in Nebraska. The land was better there than it had been in South Dakota, but it was nothing like home. It was not Minnesota. A changing landscape. In the summer of 1863, hardly anyone lived in southwestern Minnesota. Nearly all the settlers in the region had abandoned their homes during the war. Most of the Dakota either had fled from the state or been exiled. Only about 200 Dakota who had helped the settlers during the war were allowed to stay. As the years went by, the Dakota remained separated. Many chose to stay on reservations in Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Canada. Many others, however, wanted to return home to Minnesota. This is where their people are from. This is where their ancestors lived. Within a few years, some of the Dakota who had been forced to leave their homeland returned to live alongside their relatives who had been allowed to stay in Minnesota. Beginning in the 1880s, these Dakota worked with the U.S. government to establish new communities at Old Upper and Lower Sioux agencies at Prairie Island and at Prior Lake. By the time they established these communities, though, the Dakota could hardly recognize the land they had lived on for generations. It had changed forever. Tens of thousands of new settlers had moved to Minnesota, intent on farming the land in the European American style. So the landscapes completely changed. Instead of having the buffalo roaming on all of the hills, now it's farmland, 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 farmland. Very, very different. Never forget, the outcomes of the U.S.-Dakota War still affect people today. In November of 2002, a group of Dakota set out on a march to remember their ancestors. They walked nearly 150 miles from the Lower Sioux Interpretive Center to Fort Snelling to honor the journey their ancestors made in 1862. It took 6 days to make the trip. The 2002 march was the beginning of a tradition. Other similar events have taken place since then. More people participate each year. Dakota educator Gwen Westerman has participated in this event multiple times over the years. She explains, this is a ceremony. It's not a protest. It's not a reenactment. It's a spiritual ceremony for healing and for honoring those women and children we descend from. We remember their strength and their determination. Those innocent women and children who were forced to march that long, long ways, they're honoring them, saying, you survived this. And we appreciate what you went through so we can still be here. So it's a way of remembering their ancestors and what they went through. Not a protest. They're not saying, oh, they were wronged. They shouldn't have been treated that way. It's not what it's about. It's a way of remembering. Remembering is a wonderful thing. We should remember our history, the good and the bad. Remember, we talked about that circle of history? We don't want it to repeat itself. So we need to remember the good so it continues, and we need to remember the bad so we don't repeat it. So we learn from it and we can change our ways. Thoughts on this chapter? What kind of feelings do people have? There's a lot of emotion and passion tied into this chapter with the different perspectives that we were seeing. What do you guys think? I know we're not living 150 years ago, but some of this still affects us today. Edward.
It's like an end of the entire thing, like we have Revolution, Civil War.
Yeah. This is the end of an era, right? Everything's changed since then. So this brought about huge change for the Dakota, huge change for Minnesota. Minnesota's a much different state now. A lot of it's based on that war. That war ended everything that the Dakota had in Minnesota. Nothing was left for them. So everything has changed. All right, so we have a few people that are on vacation that might be listening to this later. We hope you are enjoying yourselves and you are well, and we hope to see you soon. And have a wonderful weekend.